Hi, it's Mike Gant, and this is the weekly teaching video for Saturday, July 9th, I think it is. At any rate, I was telling you about how I wrote the book Everyone is Going to Heaven. And I talked last week about, how it had come to me and I saw it, but then I just kind of, through the day-to-day grind, lost track of that. Again, not proud of that, not defending that, but just admitting that. And so for the years that followed, I did not, I didn't preach on that subject, and I hadn't preached on going to hell anyway. I don't think I ever did that. But prior to that time, I had this sense that someone needs to come to a personal decision about a relationship with Jesus Christ if they wanted to spend eternity in heaven. And if they didn't, that would be the outcome. So, that was always, kind of somewhere in the back of my mind. And, in terms of thinking about people and praying about people and, how I conducted myself. But when this happened, I didn't worry about that anymore. As I said, just great peace came over me. So fast forward, that was probably around 1982. Fast forward to 1993, I'm pastoring a church in St. Louis, and I've been pastoring it. And this other event happened in St. Louis too. But I'm pastoring a church now for about 7 years, and have been through just the normal things you go through when you're pastoring a non-denominational church. And I had relationships with lots of other pastors in St. Louis. And so we all, shared what we learned, things we knew, we prayed together. And all of us were sort of in the same boat. And, one or two of the guys had pretty big churches, but most of us had churches of anywhere from 100 to 200 people. And it was just hard to ever break that, break out of that. You think, well, why do you need to break out of that? Well, you're losing people all the time. You lose a certain number of people because people are somewhat transient. They move into an area and they move out of it. But you lose a lot of people just because there's a lot of turnover in churches. People, get tired of the church they're going to, or they think there's a better one to go to, or there's a cooler one to go to, or just a lot of churning of people moving around. And for us, it was a lot of us were family would leave one of our congregations and go to another one. Well, anyway, I reached a point where I just was desperate for God to help me figure this out. We had talked about these things. We read books. We studied. We did everything we could. And I got to a point where I was so desperate, and I prayed, and I said, God, I am going to shut myself up and read my Bible and study it harder than I ever have. And I'm going to do whatever it says about building your church. And if I do that, and if it doesn't work out, then so be it. I'll just have to find some other line of work. But I'm going to do what it says. And I'm not going to look to any other source. I'm not going to look to any other person. I'm not going to read any more books about how you build a church. I'm just going to look at the Bible and do whatever it says. And so that began a period of days and weeks and probably several months of just spending, hours and days on end studying the scriptures for this, going back to the most fundamental aspects of the faith. And as I was doing that, I was starting to get spiritually renewed, and I remembered this experience that I'd had about everyone going to heaven. And so I thought, well, I might as well make this part of the mix, bring this into the mix too. So I made, as part of that, I said, well, I'm just going to study the scriptures for this and see whether this is true or not. And so I began to study them. And lo and behold, I studied them. And, I knew there were scriptures in there that said things as in Adam all die, in Christ they all shall rise. I knew there were scriptures like that. But evangelical theology always has a way of explaining that away. And on any controversial subject, there's always certain verses you can pick out which support one point of view, and certain verses you can pick out which support the other point of view, or the opposite point of view. So the fact that I had known that there were verses that supported that didn't really help me for that reason. But what I began, when I first of all started doing a word study of hell, And I started going through the scriptures, every place it said hell, and study. And one of the first things I learned is that when you go into the Old Testament, it talks about a word Sheol, and I had seen it before, but I just never really paid much attention to it. It was just kind of, it's there. Yeah, that's a word that the Hebrews use when they talk about death. But I figured if it was important, somebody would have talked about it before. But as I studied it, I began to see, well, no, they were talking about Sheol in a very specific way. And if you read the Old Testament, it says everyone when they died went to Sheol, and Sheol was below. So right there, I knew that what I had been taught about when you die, you go to either heaven or hell, you go above or below. I knew something was, that right there, pulled the supports out from under that. And I knew that, yes, I must have been on the right track, that really was God that I heard back in 1982. And, so I studied, and then the next thing you know, I'm learning that, well, in the New Testament, the word Sheol is translated Hades, because Sheol is the Old Testament word. Hades is the Greek word. Sheol is the Hebrew word, and Hades is the Greek word for the same thing. And I always thought Hades was another way of saying hell. But in reality, when I studied the Bible, I saw that Hades is another way of saying Sheol. Well, I hadn't even known you were supposed to say Sheol. So I thought, wow, we've got all these verses that talk about Sheol and Hades. We've got them wrapped into this word called hell, and they don't even mean the same thing. Hell, when you break that down, is traced to a word called Gehenna. And Gehenna was a Greek word. Originally in Hebrew, it was Ben Hinnom. But that was completely separate. That had to do with fire and a trash heap outside of Jerusalem. So I'm not going to take you back through the whole book there, but that became the book. That's why I call it the biblical case for everyone going to heaven. Now, the original title of the book was simply Everyone is Going to Heaven. I just wrote the case that way. And I typed it on this computer. It was Intel 286 processor, which I thought was, pretty fast at the time. It wasn't the fastest thing they had going, but it's what I could afford. And it had this little narrow screen, and I typed that thing. And I ended up doing the whole book, and we printed it out and took it to whatever the equivalent of Kinko's was at the time. And, it turned out to be about that thick and had plastic spiral. You've seen it kind of like a thick paper cover, blue cover, and had a little square hole in it so that you could see through the words on the next page. Everyone's going to heaven. And I began giving them away to my congregation. Only by this time, I had been studying enough in the Bible to see that, and I was building the church God's way, and I saw that he was saying this is my church, so I knew it wasn't my Mike Gantz church. And I'm not going to take you through that whole story now. That's a whole separate story. But by this time, I had stopped trying to have a church and had changed it to, the church had been called Westport Church. I changed the name to Westport Ministry. And I continued to do teaching, but I was teaching, more through like cassette tapes and like this book I wrote. And I wrote it in what you could call a very pastoral way. I wrote it such that people could have it and then pass it out to their neighbors. And I wrote it in such a way as to address the average person, the average, family living in St. Louis, raising kids, who, either they were evangelical and believed, some people were going to hell, or maybe they weren't that religious, but they were sort of aware of that. And anyway, they wanted to know what happened to people when they die. That was the way I framed it. And we printed them up and we gave them away. And much to my surprise, it did not bless a lot of people the way it blessed me. Few people it affected the way it affected me, but most people, they got mad about it. I remember one guy that used to come to one of my Bible studies, and he was just a very sweet guy. But man, he was upset with me. And he said, "You got to take this back." He lived way on the south side of St. Louis, and he drove up to see me. I hadn't seen him in a long time. And he said, "You got to recant. You got to take this back. This is heresy." And it was an awkward meeting. But then, through a set of circumstances, had to leave the ministry entirely, mainly because there's nothing mysterious. It's just we ran out of money. We had been living partially off of savings for a while, and we just went as far as we could, and so we were down to, I think it was about $400. That's all we had, my wife and I, and 4 kids, and so I knew God did not want me to beg people for money, and I knew He didn't want me to go into debt. So I didn't know a lot of things, but I knew that, and so I thought, okay, well then I can't be a full-time minister. I've got to go back to work. So I did, and when I went back to work, I never felt comfortable trying to minister when I was working, because the only reason I felt comfortable ministering was because of the time I spent studying. I could stand up in front of people on Sunday morning and teach them this is what God's Word said, because I had had time to study it. And, when you're trying to earn a living and trying to raise 4 kids, at least for me, it wasn't a practical matter to have enough time to study and then be able to teach as well. So I didn't teach all those years. But as I got close to retirement and went through a phase of semi-retirement first, I found time. And although I'd never planned to come back and go into ministry again, I did. And so when I started blogging in late 2009, December 2009, and then in 2010, I thought, well, I'll take that book and put it online. So I took the book and put it online. And then more recently, I put it in digital form. So that's the story of that's a little bit of the story, the background of the book. I'm basically telling it because it's the truth, because it matters to me, because I think it matters to everyone that affects. I think it's wonderful news. I'm thrilled that it's true, and I just want other people to have that blessing, that knowledge. I don't think it makes sense to seek God and to study His Word, and then when He reveals it to you, to not tell anybody. I wouldn't know these things unless I had prayed and sought God and sought Him to be able to bring His Word to people like me, families like mine. So everyone is going to heaven, and that's some of the background of the story. I appreciate the opportunity to share it with you. God bless you. Till next time.